Dan Henderson became a double champion before anyone else. The former Pride welterweight and middleweight champion was one of the most exciting fighters in MMA history. And that also led him to the Strikeforce light heavyweight championship, but he was never able to capture UFC gold. So how good was Dan Henderson actually? Hey guys, it's Kiiyon, and today we're gonna talk about Dan Hollywood Henderson. Yeah, he was known as Hollywood early on in his career, which is funny because Dan is a humble and reserved man, but his performances in MMA say otherwise. So in this video, we're gonna take a look at Hendo's career to really understand how good he actually was. Before we get to the video, shout out to the Undisputed members of my Patreon. You can get early access to my content as well as a shout out before every video if you become an Undisputed member today. Now let's get to it. In June of 1997, a 26-year-old Dan Henderson entered the Brazil Open lightweight tournament. His first fight of that night was against Kiiyon de Souza. Although Kiiyon managed to secure a takedown, Dan reversed the position and threw heavy ground and pound that ended the fight. In the finals, which was also that evening, Hendo fought Eric Smith. It was a quick fight as Eric went down for the takedown, but in the process got caught by a guillotine choke that put him to sleep, making Henderson the winner of the tournament. In May of 1998, Dan entered the UFC 17 middleweight tournament. In the first round, he fought Alain Goes. Alain knocked down Hendo a couple of times in this fight, but overall, Henderson was the aggressor on the feet. He was also the aggressor when the fight got to the floor. Near the end, Goes was fading and Dan continued to increase his pressure. He won the fight by unanimous decision. In the finals, Dan fought Carlos Newton. Carlos was the much fresher fighter as his first fight lasted less than a minute, and he was looking good early by rocking Hendo with a right hand before being taken down. Henderson maintained ground control before the fight was stood up due to Newton requesting his mouthpiece. After the break, he secured a takedown, but Dan got up with ease. In the clinch, Hendo was picking Carlos apart with heavy elbows and knees. He secured a few more takedowns as well. In the overtime round, Newton rocked Henderson with a punch that broke his jaw and had him out on his feet. But Carlos got taken down again where he was controlled on the ground for the remainder of the round. It was a competitive fight, but Dan won by split decision, thus making him the tournament winner. After winning back-to-back tournaments, Hendo went back to Japan to enter the ring's King of Kings 1999 tournament. In the opening round, he fought Bakure Gogetidze. It was a brutal back-and-forth fight on the feet before Henderson connected with a big knee to the body that dropped Bakure and forced him to tap. That same night, Dan fought in the second round against Hiromitsu Kanara. The two were swinging from the start, but once they clinched, Hendo began to connect more than Hiromitsu. Henderson also secured multiple takedowns, maintained top position, and attempted a few submissions. It was a dominant performance that earned him the majority decision. Dan moved on to the quarterfinals, which was in February of 2000. After defeating Gilbert Yvel in the quarterfinals by unanimous decision, Hendo fought Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira in the semis. It was a close fight that mostly took place on the ground. Both men secured takedowns and maintained top position, but I thought Nogueira was more offensive as he tried to lock up a few submissions. Regardless, Henderson won the fight by split decision. In the finals, he fought Renato Babalu Sobral. Keep in mind, all three of these fights happened in the same night. And like his two previous matches, this one with Babalu went to the judges as well. But it was a pretty dominant performance by Dan, who out-wrestled Sobral and even had him in a tight guillotine choke at one point. On the feet, Hendo was the aggressor as he found success with his dirty boxing and knees in the clinch. Renato was gaining some momentum near the end, but it wasn't enough. Henderson won the fight by decision and became the ring's King of Kings 1999 tournament winner. Following these three tournament wins, Dan signed with Pride FC. He made his debut against Vanderlei Silva. After being knocked down and controlled on the ground by Silva early in the fight, Hendo rocked Vanderlei and secured a takedown of his own. But Silva got back up and hurt Henderson again. From this point on, it was Vanderlei's fight as he was able to maintain top position, deny Henderson's takedowns, and continue to be the aggressor on the feet. Silva won the fight by unanimous decision, which gave Dan his first loss in MMA. Hendo came back at Pride 13 to fight Renzo Gracie. He denied all of Gracie's takedown attempts, with the final one leading to a right hand that ended the fight. In his next fight against Akira Shoji, Henderson looked to be in trouble early. But once he got back up, he began to pick Shoji apart on the feet and even mounted him on the floor. But Shoji secured another takedown before the end of the round. But from the second round and beyond, the fight was in Dan's control as he battered Akira on the feet and on the floor. He secured multiple knockdowns, and at this point, Shoji was on defense mode. The fight ended in the third with punches and knees that forced the refs to step in. At Pride 17, Hendo fought Morello Ninja Rua. Henderson was aggressive early with a beautiful suplex, heavy knees, and a guillotine attempt. But Ninja survived and maintained top control for the remainder of the round. And Ninja's momentum continued in round 2 when he took Dan down immediately and controlled him there for most of the round. When they got back up near the end of the round, Hendo secured a takedown of his own. But Ninja got back up and secured another one. In the final round, Henderson was aggressive from the start as he denied Ninja's attempts to take the fight down and began to pick him apart on the feet. Despite a very good round from Dan, Ninja closed the fight off on top as he secured a takedown. It was a close fight that could have gone either way, but Hendo was given the split decision by the judges. In April of 2002, Henderson fought Ricardo Arona. It was a close battle early as both men secured takedowns and controlled the other on the ground. But Ricardo's control took over near the end of the fight, and early in the first he knocked down Hendo, which ultimately handed him the split decision. Dan came back in December of that year to fight Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira for a second time. After defending big knock submission attempts for most of the fight, he finally got caught in an armbar that forced him to tap. Following these back-to-back losses, Hendo came back with 3 straight first-round finishes against Shungo Oyama, Murilo Bustamante, and Kazuhiro Nakamura. At Pride Shockwave 2004, Henderson fought Yuki Kondo. It was a competitive fight that saw Kondo outwork Dan on the floor for most of rounds 1 and 2. But when on the feet, Hendo was picking apart Yuki, and in the third round, he dominated him with his wrestling. In the end, it was enough for him to win the split decision. In April of 2005, Henderson fought Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, the brother of Rodrigo. It was an opening round fight in the Pride 2005 Middleweight Grand Prix, and it was very competitive as both men connected with their shots and controlled the other on the ground. But near the end of the first, Rogerio secured an armbar that forced Dan to tap. After this loss, Hendo decided to move down to welterweight, which is 183 pounds in Pride FC. He entered the 2005 Pride Welterweight Grand Prix where he fought in the quarterfinals and semifinals in the same night. In the quarterfinals, he defeated Ryo Chonin in 22 seconds after connecting with big right hands that put an end to the fight. He advanced to the semis to fight Akihiro Gono. He dominated Gono on the ground and feet before dropping him with a big right hand followed by punches that ended the fight. Henderson advanced to the finals to fight Murilo Bustamante for a second time. The winner of this tournament would also win the inaugural Pride Welterweight Championship. This fight was more competitive as Bustamante connected with some shots on the feet, secured takedowns, and maintained top position. But Hendo retaliated with the same offense and even landed a big knee that knocked Murilo down to the floor. That may have been Henderson's saving grace in this really close fight as the judges awarded him with the split decision, thus making him the tournament winner and the Pride Welterweight champion. At Pride Bushido 10, Dan fought Kazuyo Misaki. Misaki was finding success with his takedowns and top control, but Hendo spent a majority of the fight as the aggressor on the feet as he was able to pressure forward at a constant pace without slowing down. At one point, he knocked down Kazuyo with a big right hand and the fight looked moments away from finishing. But Misaki survived and Henderson went on to win the fight by unanimous decision. The two fought 4 months later at Pride's 2006 Grand Prix quarterfinal. This time it was more competitive on the feet as Kazuyo was pressing forward more and connecting with his signature uppercut as well as leg kicks. Dan was landing his shots as well, but he definitely began to slow down by the second round. Hendo ended up losing this fight by unanimous decision, which marked his first loss in welterweight. So after this loss, he decided to move back up to middleweight where his first fight was against former UFC light heavyweight champion Vitor Belfort. He absolutely dominated Vitor throughout the fight both on the feet and on the ground. After 3 rounds, Henderson was awarded the unanimous decision. At Pride 33, Dan fought Vanderlei Silva for a second time, but this time with the middleweight championship on the line as after their first fight, Vanderlei became the first and only middleweight champion for the promotion, which gave Hendo the opportunity to become the first fighter in MMA history to hold titles in 2 different weight classes simultaneously. Like their first fight, this one was also very competitive as both men connected with their strikes and secured takedowns. But by the third, Henderson was a fresher fighter and beginning to press the fading Silva. Dan eventually connected with a combo that dropped Vanderlei and forced the ref to step in. Hendo became the first ever double champion. This also turned out to be his last fight with Pride before they were purchased by the UFC. So in September of 2007, Henderson fought light heavyweight champion Quinton Rampage Jackson at UFC 75. It was a closely contested bout as both men landed their shots, took each other down, and reversed the position when on their back. But Rampage took over the fight in the later rounds by knocking down Dan a couple times and securing a few takedowns. Hendo lost the fight by unanimous decision, but he was given another title fight at UFC 82 where he fought middleweight champion Anderson Silva. Henderson looked good early by securing a takedown and controlling Anderson on the ground, but Silva's pressure on the feet became too much, which led to him connecting with a knee that dropped Henderson. Anderson managed to get a hold of Dan's back where he secured a rear naked choke before the end of the round. Following this 2-fight losing skid, Hendo bounced back with decision wins against Husamar Palaris and former UFC middleweight champion Rich Franklin. In these fights, he was dominant both on the feet and on the ground. This career bounce back earned him a spot as a coach in the 9th season of The Ultimate Fighter, opposite Ultimate Fighter Season 2 winner Michael Bisping. The season was fueled with animosity between the two fighters as Bisping did not hold back on the disrespect towards Henderson, but Dan remained calm and vowed to shut him up in their fight at UFC 100. And that's exactly what he did. Dan pressured Michael the entire fight and it was obvious that he was looking to connect with a big right hand. And finally in the second round, it landed and it immediately knocked Bisping out cold. Hendo followed this up with a nasty flying forearm drop, which he would later say in his post-fight interview was to shut Michael up a little bit. That actually rose some controversy, as some believed it was unnecessary, but many view this knockout as the greatest in MMA history. And now on a 3-fight win streak in the UFC, Henderson was a top contender in the middleweight division once again. But instead of re-signing with the UFC, Dan signed a 4-fight deal with Strikeforce and made his debut against Strikeforce middleweight champion, Jake Shields. It looked like Dan was going to win another belt early as he connected with the right hand that dropped Jake, but Shields survived and began to take over the fight with his high-level grappling. Hendo lost this fight by unanimous decision. For his next fight, he decided to move back up to light heavyweight. He fought Renato Babalu Sobral in a rematch in December of 2010. This honestly was one of Henderson's nastiest knockouts as he dropped Babalu early and finished him with brutal ground and pound. Dan's next fight was against Strikeforce light heavyweight champion, Rafael Feijão Cavalcante. It was a competitive fight that saw Hendo use his wrestling to control Feijão, but Rafael was able to reverse the position when off his back and even scored a knockdown that had Hendo in a lot of trouble. But Dan finally connected with a big right hand that dropped Feijão before he finished him off with strikes on the ground. At the age of 40, Hendo became the Strikeforce light heavyweight champion. His next fight saw him move up to heavyweight for the first time in his career, where he faced former Pride heavyweight champion Fedor Emelianenko. Fedor was coming off of 2 losses, but he was still seen as a favorite over the smaller fighter in Henderson. The two were swinging immediately and rocked each other before fighting in the clinch. But when they separated, Fedor connected with a bunch of punches that knocked down Dan, who was moments from being finished by ground and pound. Hendo survived and managed to escape, and in the process, connected with an uppercut that knocked Fedor out before throwing more punches that stopped the fight. Some say that the stoppage was early and that the final punches from Henderson were to the back of Fedor's head. Regardless, it was still a huge first-round finish against a legend like Emelianenko, and it also turned out to be his last fight in Strikeforce before the company was bought out by the UFC. So Dan found himself back with the promotion for a 3rd time. In his first fight back, he fought former UFC light heavyweight champion Shogun Rua. I'm just gonna say this right now, this was the greatest fight of all time. Of course, that's just my opinion, but many people would agree with me on this statement. But a statement that everyone has to agree on is that these two legends went to war. There were moments where Hendo looked close to finishing the fight, but Shogun also had those moments as well. The momentum of this fight constantly shifted. Although Henderson looked good in the first 3 rounds, Shogun began to take over in the 4th and 5th. The final round was so dominant by Shogun that many argue it should have been scored as a 10-8, which would have made the fight a draw, but Dan ended up winning this monumental fight by unanimous decision. After this win, Hendo was supposed to fight light heavyweight champion John Jones at UFC 151, but 9 days prior to the fight, Henderson pulled out due to a partial rupture in his MCL. This ended up cancelling the entire event, which was a first in UFC history. So after a year-long layoff, Dan came back at UFC 157 to fight former UFC light heavyweight champion Lyoto Machida. The fight was uneventful as Dan tried to rush in and attack the dangerous counterpuncher in Machida. Both men secured takedowns and Lyoto connected with some nice kicks, which seemed to be enough to give him the split decision. Hendo's next fight at UFC 161 against Rashad Evans was another close one. Both men got rocked in this fight and Henderson denied most of Rashad's takedowns except for one of them. But after 3 rounds, Dan lost the fight by split decision. In November of 2013, he went to Brazil to fight Vitor Belfort for a 2nd time. Belfort finished the fight in under 90 seconds with a counter left that dropped Hendo. Vitor threw heavy ground and pound before throwing a head kick on Henderson, who was making his way back up. Dan was out cold, making it the first time he lost the fight by strikes. In his next fight, he went back to Brazil to fight Shogun Rua for a 2nd time. Hendo came out guns blazing by pressing forward and throwing with a lot of volume. Shogun looked to be hurt before he connected with a combo that dropped Henderson. Dan looked like he was out and Shogun continued throwing heavy ground and pound. Shogun carried this momentum into the 2nd by denying Hendo's takedowns and dropping him with the right hand. But in the 3rd, Henderson attempted another takedown, and when Shogun defended that, Dan opted to throw a big right hand that broke Shogun's nose. Hendo finished the fight on the ground by strikes. This was a huge win for Henderson, but the winning ended 2 months later when he fought former Strikeforce heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier. Dan was dominated by the much bigger fighter in Cormier, who out-wrestled him throughout all 3 rounds. He was eventually put to sleep by a rear naked choke near the end of the fight. After this, he moved back down to 185 to fight Gegard Mousasi. Hendo lost the fight after getting dropped by a right hand, followed by ground and pound that forced the ref to step in. Many believe it was an early stoppage. Regardless, it was 2 losses in a row. But Henderson came back in June of 2015 to fight Tim Boetsch. He defeated Tim 28 seconds into the first round with a bunch of right hands that knocked him out. 5 months later, Dan went back to Brazil to fight Vitor Belfort for the 3rd time. But much like the 2nd fight, Vitor finished Hendo in the first round with a head kick and punches. Henderson returned at UFC 199 to fight Hector Lombard. Even though Dan was close to being finished in the first round, he came back in the second by finishing Hector with brutal elbows. This one was very impressive and also happened at the perfect time, as later that evening, Michael Bisping pulled off a monumental upset that saw him win the UFC Middleweight Championship. And even though there were many middleweight contenders ready to fight for the belt, the opportunity for a rematch between the two was way too hard to pass up. So at UFC 204 in London, England, Dan fought for the Middleweight Championship in a rematch against Michael Bisping, making him the oldest fighter at the age of 46 to fight for a UFC title. Prior to the fight, Hendo stated that win or lose, this was going to be the last fight of his career. And he looked good early as he connected with his signature Hendo bomb late in the first round, and Bisping looked moments away from being finished. But he survived and came back in the second with more pressure. He was looking good until Henderson connected with another big right that dropped him. But Michael survived once again, and going into the third, Dan looked like he was getting tired. And although Hendo stayed competitive and connected with more shots throughout the rest of the fight, Bisping was coming forward with more volume. In the end, the fight was very close. And unfortunately for Hendo, it was Michael Bisping who won the rematch by unanimous decision. But many believe Henderson was robbed and should have been given the victory, including myself. Regardless, he stuck by his word and officially retired in his post-fight interview. So after going 32-15 in a career that saw him win a bunch of tournaments, the Pride Welterweight and Middleweight Championships, and the Strikeforce Light Heavyweight Championship, how good was Dan Henderson actually? So I have to admit, Dan is one of my favorite fighters of all time. And the biggest reason is because of his toughness. Even though he entered the sport with Olympic wrestling credentials, he began to fall in love with his striking as his career progressed. I mean, his Hendo bomb is legendary in itself. And match this up with his granite chin that helped him constantly move forward during exchanges and never back down, we got to witness one of the greatest brawlers in MMA. Hendo has been in some of the greatest fights in the history of the sport, and his competition for most of his career was against the elite. Even though he hasn't won all of them, he's won enough to build one of the most impressive resumes, which includes greatest knockout of all time and greatest fight of all time. And in a lot of the fights he lost, he was still competitive in. Henderson stepped up to fight the toughest guys regardless of being the underdog in most of the matchups due to his size and age. And because of that mentality as well as his humble attitude, it was hard to root against him. Out of 10, I would give Dan's career a score of 9. I would also put him in the top 10 for greatest middleweights, top 10 for greatest light heavyweights, and top 15 for greatest pound for pound fighters of all time. Now I know I say this for many of the fighters in my videos, but I really mean it for Dan when I say that he showed a lot of heart in his career. Maybe in another reality we see him win the belt against Michael Bisping or even John Jones. But even without a UFC championship under his name, Dan Henderson truly deserves to be recognized as a legend in MMA. My name is Kiiyon, and this is my take on how good Dan Henderson actually was. Do you agree, disagree, or have something else to add? Please put in the comments down below, because I love to read it. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. But that's all I have for now, so I'll see you on my next one.